Hey everyone, how's it going? It's David from the Geek Garage podcast. I hope that you are all doing well. I am also well. I just wanted to record a quick episode letting you all know the current goings-on of the podcast. I know that things have been a little off-kilter as of late, especially these last couple months. Basically, I just wanted to take a moment to record a quick episode on the state of affairs of the podcast, the current happenings, new things coming down the pike. My original plan was to kind of go over all these things in our very next episode, which I plan on recording tomorrow, but I realized it was going to be just way too much stuff to cover and preface just at the beginning of an episode, so I figured I'll record it in this and release it as its own separate episode. It can be kind of like an episode/disclaimer, and you can listen to it if you want. Don't listen to it. Whatever. I'll do quick cliff notes in tomorrow's episode. Anyways, this is episode 32, introducing phase 3 of the podcast. So, with the introduction of what I'm calling phase 3 with the show comes plenty of changes and new things, and they're basically all for the better. And if you've keeping up with what I've been posting on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, you'll be a little clued in as to what's been going on. I know I've mentioned several times that, I've been in the process of moving from one house to the other, and now I have a recording space and everything's, good, but, still kind of settling in. But now, I'm officially in a space, both mentally and physically, where I can record again, and it's awesome. And that's what prompted me to kind of kickstart this whole new phase. And I also realized that there was previous phases that the podcast was in, and I didn't even realize it. So the first thing worth mentioning about this new phase is something that isn't necessarily quote-unquote new. Back in May, we introduced a new segment of the podcast called Geek Garage Goes to the Movies. And we have taken some time to go over this new segment, both, on the internet, on our social media sites, and on the website, and on the podcast, obviously. But I wanted to take another quick second and kind of reiterate some things that we've said, and just kind of explain it a little bit more in detail, since I haven't had this opportunity to. Basically, I realized that, 25 episodes deep, the majority of our show consisted of movie episodes. And instead of focusing on geek media related material, I was just kind of focusing on movies. Granted, some of those were, comic book movies, MCU, DC, blah, blah, blah. I was still focusing too much on movies, so I thought it would be appropriate to have a separate segment or chapter of the podcast. And that's around the time where my buddy Ted, who's been my co-host for this segment, kind of was, we were talking about it, and we were initially going to start our own podcast separate from Geek Garage and do movie episodes. But we figured, with already an established fan base with the Geek Garage, and the interest behind doing a separate segment of this podcast that's based just on movies would be kind of cool. So that's how we ended up doing that. Now we have our own separate corner of the show to do just movie episodes. So yeah, that kind of covers, the whole Geek Garage Goes to the Movies thing. It has been really great having Ted on the podcast. We have a lot in common, and he has a lot of interesting thoughts on movies. We don't always see eye to eye on everything, which despite what people on the internet may think, that's actually a good thing because it creates conversation. And as long as, you don't get too hostile, then it can actually be a good thing. And, it can create this really neat back and forth and, whatever. But anyways, he's been really great in his capacity as co-host for that segment, and I'm definitely looking forward to having him continuing to be on the podcast and as my co-host for that. The next thing that I wanted to talk about in regards to this new phase was basically what kind of kickstarted this whole phase 3 thing. To begin with, and I know you're probably saying, like, what the fuck? Like, where was phase 1 and phase 2? And also, this has nothing to do with Marvel. I'm just calling it phase 1 and 2 and 3 because I am not witty enough to come up with something else better. So yeah, basically, when I first started the podcast back in February of 2017, I really had no clue what I wanted to do with it. I knew that I wanted to put out cool, hopefully quality content about or surrounding geek media related material, but that was pretty much it. I didn't know how often I wanted to put out episodes. I didn't know if I was going to be able to rely on, co-host to be on for every single episode. Basically, for the first 5-6 episodes, I believe, I had Andrew and Connor from Two Player Media helping me out, and that was great. But they have their own lives. They got really busy. Their careers really took off, so they weren't really able to kind of help me out, all the time. So that's kind of what I consider phase 1 was, that brief time span from episode 1 to, I want to say, 10 or 11. And that was about the first, 9 to 12 months of the podcast. And what brought about phase 2 was, them kind of exiting as semi-regular co-hosts and me running the show solo and, doing everything by myself. I would, go find my own guests to come on the podcast and all that. And it was definitely a lot to handle, but I definitely learned a lot through trial and error and fucking up and making all kinds of mistakes. And then, I would get, I would have successes along the way, thankfully. And then around March of this year, things kind of got nuts in my life. Nothing super dramatic. My wife and I and our kids, we just simply outgrew our house that we were living in at the time. And we just needed a new space. So there was this huge time period from about March until like 2 weeks ago, when we didn't really have a place to call our own. We were living in her parents' basement, and I didn't really have an appropriate place to record or anything. So that is the main reason why there was no episodes put out for a long time, or if there were episodes, it was on a very limited basis. But like I said, all that is basically done and over with. All the messiness. I am officially, moved in to my new house. I have, my own recording space. It is awesome. It's cool to have a door where I can close and, have the outside world just kind of be on the outside and kind of focus on things a little bit better, because beforehand at my old house, the recording setup was just in our kitchen, which, I mean, it was great, and it was fine in its capacity, but yeah, I mean, you can only get so much done. There's distractions, people walking in and out, so it's very nice to actually have a kind of recording space, office space, whatever you want to call it. So that's basically what is kicking off phase 3 of the podcast, is just me being settled, me being able to do episodes on a regular basis. And with all of that, I didn't want to roll out too much new stuff. I wanted to get back to, quote unquote basics. I know that there really wasn't a whole lot of, continuity or basic stuff to begin with the podcast. However, I did want to, or during this period of time where I didn't really have the ability to put out, episodes, I did come up with a lot of cool ideas that I think are going to work out really well, or at least I hope will work out really well. And if they don't, at the very least, they will be learning experiences, and they will only help further the content of the show further. So, yes, getting on with the actual content and the new stuff. The biggest emphasis for Phase 3 will be to, for the first time, put out consistent content. This is basically priority number 1. And that is no surprise, because I have never been able to put out content on a regular basis. It's always been one of those things where, recording never fell by the wayside. This, passion project has always been just that. It's been, a passion of mine. I really like talking about this shit. I, enjoy having, guests on and talking about certain fandoms and all that. I just didn't really have the ability. Things were just always happening. But now, like I said, things have finally gotten to the point where I can record episodes on a consistent basis. Another change up that I plan on implementing is having my wife Lindsay on more episodes. The plan as of right now is to have her on pretty frequently. Not necessarily every single episode of the main show of Geek Garage, but she will definitely be on quite a few. She has been on a few episodes in the past, but you will definitely be hearing more from her. I think if you haven't heard her on the podcast before, she's, a super nerd just like the rest of us. She's obsessed with, certain fandom. She loves Harry Potter. She loves the X-Files and true crime and just, any other nerdy shit that you can possibly think of. So I'm very excited to start having her on the podcast on a frequent basis. Another big change you'll see with the show is how the episodes are actually structured and how the content is structured. And since my goal is, my number one goal is to do a episode a week or episodes on a consistent basis. I want to do episodes like, one per week. And I'll be covering a lot of like contemporary news, and things that are currently going on within the realm of, geek media, what's going on at the box office, what's, going on with certain fandoms, just anything that's been consistent with the overall theme of the podcast up until now. I want to include and do contemporary episodes. So, think of almost like Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, but, centric on geek media related material. For instance, in our next episode, number 33, I'll be discussing a few small news events and one big one. The plan as of right now is to kind of go over this fucking pissing match between Sony and Disney. I'm going to talk about the upcoming Matrix 4 film, and a few other things that have popped up in between the beginning of this week and today. And then the main story will be dedicated to the Walkman, which is actually turning 40 years old this year. For those of you who don't know what the Walkman is, I seriously doubt that there's no one that listens to the podcast that at least knows what the Walkman is. However, if you're one of those people, it's the device that Star-Lord listens to in Guardians of the Galaxy with the orange earbuds. And like I said, it's turning 40 years old, and I didn't want to do like a whole episode on like the history of the Walkman and all that and how it came to be about, which is interesting. I was reading up about it this week, and it's actually pretty cool, the history of it itself. But I wanted to dedicate a lot of time to the evolution of portable music, and I really firmly believe that the Walkman kind of kickstarted the revolution of mobile music. So I really think that it's going to be a pretty cool conversation. And lastly, we'll soon be bringing you a whole new way to experience the podcast. We've been talking about either doing recorded video and or live streaming for a good while now. And we feel like, with not to beat a dead horse with what I've said a million times already during this episode about finally being in the right space to do it, we feel like it's a good time to go ahead and venture into video. And like I said, we'll probably start with some recorded video and venture soon after that into live streaming once we get our feet wet with just doing video with the audio as well. For those of you who like listening to our podcast or podcasts in general or music on YouTube, we are currently on YouTube. We have our YouTube channel. Unfortunately, it's not yet youtube.com/Geek Garage Podcast or anything like that. I think you have to have a certain amount of subscribers or views or videos or something like that in order to have your own custom domain. But I mean, if you just go to YouTube and type in Geek Garage Podcast, you'll find us, no problem. And we do have the majority of our episodes up and going on YouTube currently. So if that is a avenue that you really enjoy using for your content, whether it's video, audio, whatever, then we are currently on there, and our plan is to definitely focus more on YouTube. Obviously not more than audio itself and actual podcast apps, but just having that available for our listeners, because we brought this up in the podcast, both in the main show and the movie episodes. Ted and I, we went to MTAC, the Middle Tennessee Anime Convention, back in April of this year, and one of the most common things we heard when we did one of the most common things we heard when we were doing our guerrilla marketing thing was people were asking if we were on YouTube, and we were like, what the hell? Like, we've heard this a million times today. Like, we're audio. Like, I mean, I would love for you to explain why you would ask if a podcast is on YouTube. And, they were like, we don't care if there's video attached to it necessarily. It's just, I get my other content from YouTube. So it would be cool to be able to consume everything in just one place. So that's why we are trying to focus our efforts more into the YouTube avenue, just as much as we do with the others, with Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, everything else, everywhere else where you can find the podcast where it's just audio. So yeah, like I said, for right now, it's going to be just strictly video for at least a couple episodes, and then on down the road, maybe about a month or so, we'll do some live stream episodes. I think that's going to be a whole fuck of a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it, because especially when we talk about news topics, things that have been happening, and I can have either Lindsay, my wife, or someone else kind of moderate the comments by viewers, and people can chime in and say, hey, you forgot to mention blah 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 on the news, and then they can tell me, and we can talk about it. So there'll be some cool interaction between me and listeners / viewers. And that will be cemented in eternity, where people can go back and listen to it for audio or for video, and I'm just really excited about it as a whole. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Like I said, I just wanted to record a quick episode covering all this, so I didn't have to spend 20 minutes at the beginning of the next episode, on all this bullshit, which, I mean, it's not bullshit, but, it's stuff that is necessary to kind of get out of the way. And as I said at the beginning, I'll kind of do the Cliff Notes version, in the next episode. So yeah. That will do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. As always, like, subscribe, follow, do all that fun shit on the internet, on social media. Subscribe to the podcast. Like I said, we're on Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, of course. And pretty much anywhere else you can find podcasts. If you wouldn't mind too terribly, if you do enjoy the podcast, please leave us a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us out a lot. We care about reviews more than money. We don't really care about money at all. That's why we don't really have a Patreon. We mainly just care about our position in the rankings, and that's exactly what happens when you leave us a rating and review, specifically a good rating and review, is it boosts us up in the rankings and in iTunes and the Google Play Store and all that, where we become more of a relevant show. So when people go to find like comedy shows or geek media related shows or whatever, we'll pop up more frequently and be easily discovered. So yeah, go do all that, and of course, be kind, stay geeky, and eat lots of motherfucking cheesecake.